I got interested in what I knew as the psychology of religion as an undergraduate. Because I grew up in a faith community, I recognized how important religious beliefs and practices were to people, how much religious identity shaped who they were, and particularly in at least my cultural context and how people thought about God, how important that was to people. And yet, what I found as an undergraduate, even starting to look at, well, where do God concepts come from? How are they shaped? Was that not a lot of people taking a cognitive science approach or a cognitive psychology approach even were actually asking these questions. So I started looking at God concepts from a real cognitive perspective as opposed to a personality perspective or a clinical perspective or something like that. I ended up bumping into these guys who were starting what we now call the cognitive science of religion. So I met Pascal Boyer by way of my advisor, graduate advisor. And so he and I started exchanging snail mail back in the day, sending up papers to each other and talking that way. And
So it was Frank Keel that put you two in touch, you and Pascal?
yeah, they'd been at a conference together, so they knew each other. Frank, well, I studied at Cornell, and a former, longtime Cornell professor was Ulrich Neisser, who actually coined the term cognitive psychology. He then had left Cornell for Emory University, where he knew Bob McCauley.
Ah.
And so Frank shared sort of the first draft of one of my first papers with Neisser, who shared it with Bob, who shared it with Tom Lawson. And then Tom Lawson reached out to me and said, hey, we need to meet. So then I meet these guys at a Society for Scientific Study of Religion conference. That's Tom Lawson and Bob McCauley.
What year was that?
Maybe 94?
Oh, really? Okay.
Somewhere around there, 94, 95, but it couldn't have been later than that. And then Tom invited me to a conference that he was hosting at Western Michigan that included Harvey Whitehouse and Pascal Boyer as presenters as well. And so that's when I met those guys. So Tom Lawson really got us all together and was really encouraging. But it became clear immediately, right? These guys, they're either from religious studies, philosophy, or anthropology. And they had some really interesting insights. They were hanging out with cognitive scientists of various sorts and coming up with some really creative theoretical kind of models. But none of them were trained scientists.
Yeah.
And you might not know that looking at Pascal's Boyer's work here of late, right? I mean, he's really cross-trained himself a lot. So he's pretty good at this stuff. But back then, he was really a novice when it came to putting together experiments. And so it was fun to be part of then a movement. It was fun to be welcomed into something. Because in my field, psychology, the study of religion was regarded with huge suspicion. I was actively discouraged from doing it. I don't think there was any hostility to religion necessarily. I think they thought there were better questions. They didn't think of it as terribly important. Mostly because of the cultural context in which they grew up in. I've run into psychologists at conferences who go, why would you ever study religion? I don't know anybody religious. They're like, well, do you ever get out of Manhattan? I mean, it's just because they're from really strange places. And so there was some of that, and there was also just there's no career future in that. And if you go to an Ivy League sort of program, as you know, there's lots of, our students go on to these great career types of things. And there's no funding for studying religion. So you can't get a great career in that. Yeah. There are no jobs in the area, was their kind of attitude. So they really wanted to discourage me. They were looking out for me, they thought, as well. But that wasn't what I was getting from these guys who they're studying religion and they want to do it scientifically, but they don't have any scientific training. And so we had really fun early conversations about, well, how would you start exploring the ideas they were developing using experimental and other kinds of research designs? That's how I started doing it. I was that guy, that was the only guy in the group who had that skill set. So I kind of got pulled into it that way. And it was a lot of fun because they were coming with so much more knowledge about religion writ large, all over the world than I had. And so they taught me about that. and I could teach them about research methodology, at least from this kind of approach.
Yeah.
I think things are getting a little better, but there's still a lot of resistance. Cognitive psychologists, which is the biggest sort of piece of the cognitive science pie, in terms of both positions and just sort of counting noses, they still generally don't look at these kinds of topics. And it's not necessarily because they're not interested in religion. They don't look at any kind of I'm overstating it. It's rare that they look at what's called higher order cognition. So how beliefs are formed in belief-like states, certainly systems of beliefs. They don't think of themselves as doing that sort of thing. So they've left it for sort of social psychologists to do that kind of work, or developmental psychologists.
Yeah.
Developmental psychology is probably the place where it's safest to do the kind of work that I've been doing. Social psychology has come along, the cognitive wave, and honestly, while there are now a lot more people doing a psychological kind of approach to the scientific study of religion, not many of the folks who are doing it are actually addressing the kinds of theories that cognitive science of religion has developed. There's something that I'm pointing to a pretty subtle distinction, I think, but I think it's an important one. In that cognitive science of religion, at least when it was started, what we called then the cognitive conspiracy or cognitive approaches to the study of religion, the thing that we were trying to explain is why are certain kinds of beliefs and practices cross-culturally recurrent?
Yes.
And when they deviate, why? What are the interesting local particulars that might then account for differences from those general patterns? But my point is that the thing that we're trying to explain was really at the cultural level. It was at the group level. It wasn't at the individual level.
Yeah.
We're appealing to individual level psychology and psychological dynamics to account for what we're seeing on the cultural level, but we weren't trying to account for individual level religious expression.
Yeah.
And most of the social psychologists who have sort of gotten excited about this area, and even a lot of the developmental psychologists, they're doing really psychology of religion that has a cognitive flavor to it or an evolutionary flavor to it, but they're not necessarily doing much cognitive science of religion, if you take my distinction, because they're actually looking at individual level expression. And I don't draw too hard a line between these, because I think they can mutually inform each other. But here's an example of what I mean.
Okay.
So with this agency detection stuff, right? Some folks are out there trying to say, well, can we measure individual level variation in their agency detection sensitivity?
Yeah.
And does that then correlate with their sort of degree of belief intensity in gods or spirits or things like that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's interesting research. That's kind of cool. Do that.
Yeah.
But that's actually not what cognitive science of religion was trying to account for. It wasn't trying to account for individual variability on the basis of individual variability of the cognitive mechanisms. But it's trying to identify what are the generally present human cognitive mechanisms, what's the normal band of their operation, and how does that inform what becomes group level expression. So in agency detection, I don't assume that everybody who believes that the house at the end of the street is haunted does so because their agency detection device went off. It only takes one person to have a had experience, to come back and report it in a credible kind of way, and for us to have a general trust in that person. And we all might be inclined to think that the house at the end of the street is sort of haunted.
Right.
But I need to have a particularly sensitive agency detection device for that to happen.
I see. Yeah.
There's not necessarily a very strong relationship between my agency detection sensitivity and my beliefs. Yeah, that's a good question. My attention hasn't primarily been on cross-cultural differences, but that doesn't mean they don't show up. I've been a part of a big project that we've done in China, trying to replicate a bunch of studies in cognitive science of religion in China, collaborating with lots of people who've worked in the area, like Deb Kellerman and, some of my former students as well. But I mentioned Kellerman because some of her studies then have been replicated in the Chinese context, right? So what she's found is this general tendency to see what you might think of as design and purpose in the natural world. And so you might wonder, well, is that part or a function of growing up in certain kinds of religious contexts? And so you might look in China where it seems less likely that at least in the East Coast cities, that it's so saturated with that kind of language. And do you see that tendency there as well? And lo and behold, you do, but it seems to be overridden at a younger age. It disappears at a younger age. And in adults, it seems to be sort of reduced.
Okay.
And so then you might think, well, that tells us something really interesting about what's going on cognitively, that these systems can, under certain kinds of cultural context, be kind of tamped down in some ways.
Yeah.
So they don't give expression. And I think that's really important nuance to some of the theoretical work in the area too. It's really easy to say, okay, we think these are the basic ingredients for lots of thought, cultural thought that we might call religious. But why don't they sort of express themselves in exactly the same way across culture if we all have the same equipment? Well, suddenly the cultural context becomes very important for looking at, which ones sort of get celebrated, get refined, get sharpened, and which ones are sort of discouraged or sort of squished down.
Yeah.
Another example that looking at a lot of the Eastern traditions is really helpful for Westerners to pay attention to, and this was part of the project as well, is thinking more about qi, life force in the Chinese context.
Yeah.
It's really culturally elaborated in the East. It's almost not at all culturally elaborated in the West. So does that mean it's just a product of culture? Well, no, that's the wrong way to think about it, I think. I think because there's developmental evidence that even little kids in the West have this kind of notion of animating life force, separating living things from non-living things. We just don't talk about it like adults.
Yeah.
As adults, it just hasn't become part of our cultural parlance. But that doesn't mean it isn't in there, in the background, doing certain kind of inferential work. It just hasn't been culturally elaborated. Is it a real issue? Well, sure, it's an issue. It's a real issue in the sense that people's personal identities, who we think of ourselves as, who we want to identify with, are all wrapped up in these issues. So I'll personalize that a little bit. Growing up, I was from a fairly theologically conservative tradition that had no truck with human evolution. Didn't.
Yeah.
And through the course of my undergraduate and graduate education, I came to the position that the preponderance of evidence supported human evolution. That's the best explanation we have for how things came about. And I could see right away, on a purely intellectual kind of perspective, there was no conflict between that and the idea of there being a creator God who has set up the cosmos in a particular type of way and uses evolution to bring about creatures like us. There's no necessary conflict there as far as I can tell, and not even a conflict with biblical authority because of various complicated things about reading the first, at least the first few chapters of Genesis, but of course the whole Bible. So intellectually, I didn't see a problem, but sort of personally, of course there's a problem, because how do I explain to my parents and grandparents and the people who matter to me most in some ways that I now have a belief that they regard as really suspect? Yes. And maybe indicative of other kinds of things. So there's something real about the issues on that level. Yeah. They're real social, personal kinds of issues.
Yeah.
On the intellectual level, are there conflicts between certain kinds of scientific theories and findings and certain theological claims? Well, sure, there are. But that's so broad that in some ways it's not all that interesting.
Yeah.
Is there in principle conflict? Not as far as I can tell. And in fact, I mean, most of the time when people are worried about the conflict, they have in mind usually something like the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity in particular. Is it in conflict with modern science? Surely not. It was a big part of the development of modern science. Some of its foundations, the foundations of modern science, resonate really well with Christian theology. You know, in my own study of cognitive science of religion, have I had to make certain changes? Well, I've, in addition to becoming more comfortable with human evolution and evolutionary psychology, um, you know, I've actually learned some things. I mean, learned some things about the Christian faith that maybe I wouldn't have been receptive to. So, for instance, I came from a pretty low church kind of background, not a lot of rituals. Yeah. In fact, there was sort of a disdain for certain kinds of, you know, big public displays and rituals and things like that. And, you know, thanks to some of my colleagues working in the cognitive science of religion and evolutionary studies of religion, I've actually come to recognize how important religious ritual can be. Yeah. In the lives of people. And so it's forced me to re-examine that in myself. My own work on anthropomorphism in God concepts, which is kind of where I started, made me rethink sort of core Christian doctrines like, why does God need to become human in order to sort of reestablish a relationship with us that's, you know, been damaged in some ways? I always heard it sort of talked about that, you know, humans through sin become separated from God, and then God has to repair that relationship in some way. Jesus comes, dies for our sins, pays some price or something like that. And I'm not dismissing that, but what I'm suggesting is maybe there's an additional motivation, and that's a conceptual one. Yeah. Our conceptual sort of structures actually make it really hard for us to understand God beyond some kind of a human with a few extra add-ons, yeah, a few extra properties. And so it's a pretty good solution to the problem. If you accept that there's a God who wants to have a relationship with us, then a pretty good solution to the problem is to become one of us. Yeah. It helps that conceptual problem too. Like, oh, okay, thanks for, you know, giving me a leg up in terms of my understanding of God. So in the Christian tradition, at least for an awful long time, as you know, there's been this idea that the Reformed Christians call sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine, that John Calvin and before him folks like Augustine, drawing on St. Paul, thought is sort of just part of human nature, that we all have this kind of natural, vague, inchoate, but natural kind of receptivity to there being some other divine realm. Right? Sensus divinitatis is sort of, so it's vague, depending on who you read theologically. And then in a parallel track, this cognitive science of religion starts providing evidence that looks a whole lot like that. Mm. Well, that's interesting, because within this sort of theological space, there are lots of different models of what might be naturally part of sort of the human psyche in this regard have been offered, right? Maybe it's really particular and it gives us the idea that there's a creator God who is perfectly good and all powerful. Yeah. Well, what's the evidence? Yeah. Or maybe it's more vague. It's sort of this broad kind of thing, but it's triggered under only certain circumstances, like when you climb to the top of a mountain and you see this beautiful vista and you go, oh, there must be a God. Is that right? Or is it sort of turning around in the background in these little drips and drabs throughout our regular life? Yeah. Is that the way? Well, what's the evidence? Yeah. I see potential for cognitive science of religion in some of these areas actually to start weighing in on some of these theological debates.
Mara asks, I have a question for Justin Barrett. Here it is. How would you describe the difference between having an active imagination and humans over-detecting? Would you say that they are the same thing?
Oh, great question. Mara gets a gold star for sure. Um, and really, it's actually, she's anticipated some of my more recent thinking about this, as well as something that's just been bothering me for a long time. I think I even mention it in the 2004 book that I wrote, that I'm not confident that this thing that I've labeled as this agency detection device, or HAD, is actually one device. It's one of the sort of cool things about cognitive science and even other areas of psychology, that sometimes things that we thought are a single unitary kind of function, actually, once you start peeling things back, you realize that they are maybe interacting subsystems. And I wonder that about this area, in the way that she's maybe even suggesting here. So it's a good empirical question. Is it the case that we are trying to detect something in a perception-like way when we're looking for agents? Or I should say, or, it could be both. Is it the case that we use our imagination to think, well, what if it is an agent, right? And I actually think there's some reason to think that some what if it is kind of thinking is going on there. And maybe that's the more important part. Why do I say that? Usually when we think of detection systems, they seem to be attached to a very particular kind of immediate response, and they happen very quickly. So that would definitely be the case with any kind of fight or flight system, but we're not talking about that. That's a little too primitive. But suppose you're detecting a snake. And humans seem to have some kind of a system that preferentially looks out for these little wiggly things that are snake-like. Well, we've got these behavioral repertoires as well as physiological responses that are just linked to that, right? Immediate sort of heart racing, pupil dilation, jumping back, aversive kind of behaviors. At the very least, even of those of us who get kind of comfortable with snakes, there's a little bit of physiological arousal, which is why we think they're kind of cool. But is that kind of thing going on here when we think we've detected an agent? Not always, it seems to me. That may be the case sometimes. Like, I used to work in, like, one of my jobs during college, during the summers, was to go and work in a record storage facility, like for old files, and for one of the district attorney's office, the prosecutor's office. And so they also had mannequins in there that they'd use for court trials, and I'd be out there alone with these mannequins, and it would freak me out.
That's creepy.
It's freaky. There's something about mannequins, right? In fact, I think somebody needs to do a study on why mannequins are freaky. But I think it's because we get this sort of, they're triggering whatever our system is, our cognitive systems for detecting human-like forms, and that triggers agency automatically, because human-like forms mean someone's there.
Yeah.
And yet, they're not giving us the other cues that we would normally get with agency, like self-directed movement. Yeah. And so there's something uncanny about mannequins, in the same way that corpses might be a little bit sort of off-putting for similar kinds of reasons, that we're getting sort of cross signals. That's one kind of detection, but the imagination type of thing is more on the, I don't see an agent, right? I see something that looks like signs of agency, or I hear something that sounds like the kind of thing that could be an agent. So in the book, the 2004 book, I call this traces and events, right? And detecting those as the result of agency. That might be more of an imaginative kind of activity, where I start to wonder, well, does it fit with the possibility that an agent has been here and has acted? And if so, what kind of mental states might have gone with that agency? What kind of agent might it be, and so forth? I'm not saying that we do this with heavy cognitive conscious thought. It may be fairly automatic, because it may still be a pretty quick system that is well rehearsed by the time we get to, the time we're 5 years old, because we're having to do that all the time anyway, living around humans. So it may have some of those properties of being fast, but it doesn't have set behavioral repertoires. It's more of a, I wonder, and then it leads us to investigate further.
Right.
Which is a little different than a knee-jerk kind of, it's a snake!
Yeah. I've decided, yeah.
Kind of, right?
Yeah, it draws you in. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
I actually wonder if there is something fruitful about suggesting, well, maybe this isn't an agency detection device that's really very important to at least a lot of God concepts, but more like an agency imagination device or something like that.
Yeah.
Great question.
So yeah, we'll look ahead. We'll see what Mara does with it in her.
Yeah.
Can you please pose this question to Justin? What is the subtle difference between a category violation and a transfer of attributes from one category to another?
Good question. It's good because in some cases it is very difficult to tell the difference between the two. Okay, so this is really Pascal Boyer's difference between breaches and transfers.
Yeah.
Right. So he proposes that we basically have different, what he calls ontologies, categories of what kind of thing a thing is.
Yeah.
And its ontology specifies certain types of properties. Just intuitively, we assume that a thing that falls under that, in that bucket, has certain kinds of categories, but not other kinds of things. And so you might think of it as in the just ordinary physical object bucket, you've got these assumptions about it exists in one place in space and time. It has to move continuously through space. It can't occupy space with other things and so forth. But in the ordinary bounded objects, it doesn't have a mind.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not part of the bucket. Over here in the agent bucket, we have minds, beliefs, desires, goal-directed activity, and so forth.
Yeah.
And so if you want to put a mind in an object so that now you have a magical staff that thinks, we need to take something from this bucket and transfer it to that bucket. So that's his idea of a transfer. Whereas a breach might be things that were already in the bucket. We're going to say, nope, and throw it out of the bucket.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to make that invisible. Okay, so now it's a bounded physical object that is invisible. It's like breached.
Yeah.
Well, that's easy enough in some ways, but there are these interesting cases that it's hard to tell the difference. And they're actually pretty common in folklore and folk tales and that kind of stuff. What I have in mind are, say, animals with human-like minds and personalities.
Yeah.
Those are really common. Is it a human who has had animal properties transferred to them? I don't know. Is it an animal that's had a human-like properties transfer to them, or is neither of that quite right?
Yeah.
Are there certain limitations, say, on humanness that have been breached or violated in some way?
Yeah.
Honestly, we don't know in some of these sort of marginal cases, because our knowledge of exactly what the right buckets are and what properties go into those buckets is a work in progress. Sure. Well, and Pascal's theory was developed from both linguistic evidence, and that was cross-cultural, and primarily developmental evidence.
Yeah.
So how do conceptual structures seem to develop and develop across cultures in little kids? Well, that's ongoing work, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion. It's just about, well, what's the conceptual furniture in our heads really like? Yeah. And that picture is still developing. In some ways, that's the fun thing about cognitive science of religion. We're trying to account for cultural forms by appealing to psychology, but the psychology is moving. It's changing. And so we constantly need to update and revise and so forth. And that shouldn't make us sort of smug and sort of grumpy about, oh, these guys back 20 years ago got it completely wrong. Well, they're doing their best job with the science they had available. And of course it's going to revise and change. It doesn't mean they were dumb or anything like that. All right, bye for now.